For the last 8 years, we've seen President Obama's administration take action after action and do it without regard for concerns expressed by the American people or their elected representatives in Congress that it may amount to a great deal of unconstitutional or at least contrary to statute executive overreach. The Obama administration used executive fiat to push sweeping regulations with little thought about damage to American jobs. The Obama administration has repeatedly stretched its authority beyond limits set by Congress in law. It has twisted the same laws and even the Constitution itself to justify this executive overreach. And despite early promises of transparency, it has kept the American people and the Congress in the dark about many of its most significant decisions. Americans are right, then, to be frustrated with what they see as more unnecessary burdens and unchecked abuses being handed down by an out-of-reach bureaucracy. And in November, they made their voices heard. So now we're going to have a new president on January the 20th. President-elect Trump has said that he intends to roll back the mess of harmful regulations and executive power grabs of the last 8 years. He is certainly going to have his hands full, as we all know, but there's plenty that he can do to begin the process on January 20th. President Obama's tenure has brought about an unprecedented expansion of regulatory state. By some estimates, bureaucratic red tape now places a $2 trillion burden on the nation's economy. And you know who pays for that? The American people. I don't doubt that there is some good intentions behind about every new rule. But the notion that so-called experts in Washington, D.C. need to regulate every aspect of our lives doesn't make much sense to many of the Iowans I talk to. They are hoping that a President Trump will bring common sense to Washington, D.C. Now take, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency's Waters of the U.S. rule. It's often referred to by the acronym WOTUS. This rule seeks to expand what the government can regulate under the Clean Water Act. Congress intentionally limited EPA's reach under the law to what is termed navigable waterways. But the WOTUS rule would subject 97% of the land in my state of Iowa to EPA bureaucratic burdens. And I assume it does the same in several other states, but I've only checked on Iowa. 97% of the land to be regulated by EPA bureaucracy is just an impossible situation. Think about that. Every homeowner, every contractor, and every farmer would need to seek a federal permit for projects requiring the simple task of moving dirt, even if it's nowhere near an actual body of water. That, of course, means more paperwork, more time wasted, and, of course, more money spent to get federal permits for activities that this Congress never intended the federal government to regulate. A bipartisan majority of both houses of Congress has voiced its disapproval of the WOTUS rule, and a federal appeals court has placed a nationwide stay on its implementation. Yet, I continue to hear concerns, regardless of the Supreme Court's case, that some in the EPA are going to move forward with the rule's implementation, causing unnecessary fear and confusion among farmers and landowners. So on day one, President Trump should direct his administration to stop defending the WOTUS rule in the federal courts where it's now held up. He should also direct his EPA to immediately stop implementing or enforcing the rule while the agency begins the rulemaking process to take it off the books once and for all. It's not just official regulations that have sparked concern over the last 8 years. The Obama administration has also used executive actions, agency guidance documents, and legal interpretations to push its agenda, leaving Congress and the American people in the dark. Often this has been done with disturbing results. In 2014, the Obama administration acted unilaterally to release 5 senior-level Taliban commanders who were being held at Guantanamo Bay in exchange for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. Now, that's contrary to law. Despite the requirements of law, the administration never notified Congress, as the law requires, prior to this prisoner's transfer. The law required the administration to provide Congress with a detailed statement of the basis for the release, an explanation for why it is in our national security interest, and a plan to prevent the prisoners from returning to the battlefield. Instead, Congress heard only crickets. The administration provided no notice to the Congress, no legal justification for the release, and no plan to prevent these Taliban commanders from re-entering a fight that has already spilled so much blood of American sons and daughters. One reporter said the Taliban has been more transparent about this exchange than the Obama administration. And even the nonpartisan Government Accountability Office later concluded that the administration acted illegally. Well, it's pretty clear. The law says you got to give Congress 30 days notice. They didn't give any notice. There were and still are then serious questions about whether releasing these detainees from Guantanamo was a good idea, even to the extent to which the law was violated. So I ask this administration to disclose the legal advice that the Department of Justice apparently provided that justified its failure to notify Congress in a timely way. In other words, a justification for ignoring the law. But the Department of Justice refused to do that. The public deserves a full and transparent accounting of why the administration believed it could disregard the law. On day one, then, President Trump should order the Justice Department to produce any legal advice that it concocted to excuse the Obama administration from its obligation to notify Congress of this decision 30 days before the release, because that's what the law says. Unfortunately, this isn't the only legal opinion that the Obama administration has used to avoid scrutiny of its actions. The Justice Department also brewed up a ludicrous legal opinion to block government watchdogs from accessing federal records needed in the course of congressional oversight. And if this year has taught us anything, it's that the government needs more oversight, not less oversight. It's really unbelievable that a handful of unelected bureaucrats would try to defy the will of Congress and the people it represents by ignoring that law. Unfortunately, it hasn't stopped with that case I just cited. The Obama administration practically treats a congressional subpoena as if it were a Freedom of Information request, rather than a constitutionally mandated inquiry from a co-equal branch of government. This very issue is now being debated in the courts. But it's not just Congress that can't get information. The press and private citizens have had their Freedom of Information requests regularly met with very long delays, if they get a response at all. You know it's bad when the New York Times calls this White House the most secretive in more than 2 decades. President Trump, then, should take steps to reverse this trend of more secrecy in government, because more transparency in government will bring more accountability. On day one, he should direct his agency heads to cooperate with congressional inquiries, Inspector General investigations, and FOIA requests. And he should empower government whistleblowers. Whistleblowers expose facts about wrongdoing and incompetence inside the vast federal bureaucracy, often at risk of their own careers, their own reputations, and in some cases, I've found out, even their health. Without whistleblowers, Americans would be none the wiser that, for instance, the Justice Department walked guns that put law enforcement agencies in jeopardy. That's the Fast and Furious investigation I did. Or that the EB-5 investor visa program is riddled with fraud. Or that agencies spend tens of millions of taxpayers' dollars every year to pay employees under investigation for misconduct that just simply sit at home on paid leave. Information provided by whistleblowers under the Security and Exchange Commission whistleblower program has brought in more than $584 million in federal decisions. The Internal Revenue Service has collected more than $3 billion in tax revenue since 2007, thanks to whistleblowers, under a piece of legislation I got passed the 2006, I believe it was. And since I pushed to empower and protect whistleblowers under the False Claims Act way back in 1986, the federal government has recovered more than $48 billion in taxpayers' money lost to fraud. That ought to be simple, quantifiable information that that's a good deal. But these brave employees often face retaliation from their own ranks. So I'm going to suggest that President Trump is going to be very serious about fixing the government bureaucracy. And if he's going to do that, he should empower these patriotic citizens to help us identify fraud, abuse, and misconduct so that we can get this government working again. And now I'm going to propose to him, when I get a chance to talk to him, something I've proposed to every president since Reagan. And no president, of course, has done this, and maybe it's ridiculous for me to think that President Trump would do it, but he's come to Washington to shake things up here. And so I'm suggesting to him to empower whistleblowers, which know that there's fraud and that they're patriotic people and they want the fraud corrected, that President Trump hold a Rose Garden ceremony honoring whistleblowers. Maybe do it once a year so they know that the tone from the top, that the new commander-in-chief has the backs of these patriotic soldiers for good government that we call whistleblowers. Of course, what I've gone through here in these remarks as I finish is far from an exhaustive list, but the common thread in all of this is that the Obama administration frequently failed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed as required by our Constitution. And when that doesn't happen and Congress lets a president get away with it, then we aren't upholding our oath to the Constitution, which says basically that Congress passes a law, there ought to be a check on the executive branch to see that the laws are faithfully executed. So, a person coming to town to drain the swamp, a person by the name of Trump, should prioritize these failures and begin to restore the executive branch to its proper place in government, consistent with the checks and balances outlined in our Constitution. These actions will help that new president to make good in his pledge to fix the federal bureaucracy and do what he said last night on television in Des Moines, Iowa, put Americans first.